Life in prison without the possibility of parole. The words hung in the air like poison. Judge Harold Brennan didn't even look at the 17-year-old boy standing before him when he said it. He just leaned back in his leather chair, adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, and reached for his gavel with the casual indifference of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. The sound of wood striking wood echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot, final and absolute. Marcus Webb didn't move. He couldn't. His legs had stopped working somewhere around the word life. His public defender, a tired woman named Patricia Gomez, who carried a briefcase held together with duct tape, put a hand on his shoulder, but he barely felt it. Everything had gone numb. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed too bright. The air conditioning hummed too loud. Someone in the gallery was crying, his mother, probably. But the sound felt distant, like it was coming from underwater. "Your Honor, we'd like to request," Patricia started, but Brennan cut her off with a wave of his hand. "The defendant has been found guilty by a jury of his peers," Brennan said, his voice flat and bureaucratic. "The evidence was clear. The testimony was damning. This court has shown more than enough patience with your creative interpretations of the law, Ms. Gomez. The sentence stands." "There was no DNA evidence," Patricia said, her voice rising. "The witness identification was compromised. The chain of custody on the weapon was broken in 3 separate places. Your Honor, this boy has never been in trouble before. He's a straight-A student. He volunteers at—" "Enough." Brennan's voice cracked like a whip. "I don't care if he volunteers at a soup kitchen or tutors orphans on weekends. The jury heard the evidence. They made their decision. Now sit down, counselor, before I hold you in contempt." Patricia's jaw clenched, but she sat down. What else could she do? She had filed every motion, raised every objection, fought every procedural battle that the law allowed. But the law, as it turned out, didn't care much about a black teenager from the South Side with a court-appointed attorney and no money for expert witnesses. Marcus finally turned his head. His mother, Diane, sat in the front row of the gallery, her face buried in her hands. His younger sister Keisha sat beside her, tears streaming down her face. His uncle Raymond stood behind them, one hand on Diane's shoulder, his expression carved from stone. The rest of the gallery was packed, reporters, courthouse regulars, curious onlookers who had nothing better to do on a Wednesday afternoon than watch a child's life get destroyed. "Bailiff," Brennan said, nodding toward the uniformed officer standing by the door. "Take the defendant into custody." The bailiff, a heavy-set man with a gray mustache, approached Marcus with handcuffs. Marcus held out his wrists automatically, like he'd been trained to do this, like he'd always known this was how it would end. "This is wrong," someone shouted from the gallery. Marcus thought it might have been his uncle. "That boy didn't do nothing. Order in the court." Brennan slammed his gavel again. "One more outburst and I'll have this courtroom cleared. Bailiff, proceed." The metal cuffs clicked around Marcus's wrists. They were cold and heavy. The bailiff gripped his arm and started leading him toward the side door that would take him down to the holding cells, where he would wait until they transferred him to the state penitentiary. Life in prison. He was 17 years old. He would die in a cage. Diane Webb let out a sound that wasn't quite a scream and wasn't quite a sob. It was something worse, something that came from a place deeper than language. She tried to stand, but her legs gave out, and she collapsed back into the bench. Keisha grabbed her, holding her up. "Mom," Marcus said, his voice breaking. "Mom, I'm sorry." "You have nothing to be sorry for," Patricia hissed beside him. "Do you hear me, Marcus? Nothing. But sorry was all he had left. Sorry for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Sorry for matching a description. Sorry for walking home through a neighborhood where something bad had happened. Sorry for being black in a city that had already decided what that meant. The prosecutor, a thin man named Gerald Hutchins who wore expensive suits and had political aspirations, gathered his files with the satisfied efficiency of someone who had just won a chess match. He didn't look at Marcus. He never had. Not during the trial, not during jury selection, not during any of it. To Hutchins, Marcus wasn't a person. He was a conviction rate. He was a line on a resume. He was a step toward a better job. "Your Honor," Hutchins said, addressing Brennan with the kind of deference reserved for kings and gods. "The people thank the court for its fairness and wisdom in this matter." Fairness, wisdom. Marcus would have laughed if he remembered how. Judge Brennan nodded, accepting the praise as if it were his due. He had built a career on being tough on crime, which was a polite way of saying he had built a career on being tough on people who looked like Marcus. In 20 years on the bench, Brennan had sent more young black men to prison than any other judge in the district. The local papers called him No-Nonsense Brennan. Defense attorneys called him something else entirely. "This court is adjourned," Brennan said, already gathering his own files. He had another case in 30 minutes, some drug possession charge, probably, or maybe another armed robbery where the defendant happened to match a description. The details didn't matter. They never did. The bailiff pulled Marcus toward the door. Each step felt impossible, like walking through wet cement. His mother was still crying. Keisha was shouting something, but he couldn't make out the words. The gallery had erupted into chaos. People standing, arguing, crying, shouting at the judge who was already disappearing through the door behind his bench. Patricia followed Marcus and the bailiff, still trying to say something comforting, something hopeful. But there was nothing comforting or hopeful about life in prison. There was just the rest of his existence, stretching out like a dark tunnel with no light at the end. And then the doors opened. The main doors at the back of the courtroom, the ones that led to the marble hallway where reporters and witnesses waited. Everyone turned. The bailiff stopped walking. Even Judge Brennan, halfway through the door to his chambers, paused and looked back. Two men walked in. Both wore dark suits, expensive ones, the kind with proper tailoring and real silk ties. Both moved with the kind of authority that made people step aside without being asked. But it was the taller one, the one in front, who commanded every eye in the room. He was black, maybe 50 years old, with close-cropped gray hair and a jaw that looked like it had been cut from granite. He wore a small pin on his lapel, an American flag crossed with the scales of justice. His eyes swept the courtroom once, cataloging everything. And when they landed on Marcus, something flickered across his face. Recognition, rage, love, pain. The reporters in the gallery started whispering, then pointing, then scrambling for their phones and cameras. "Is that? Oh my God, that's... Someone get a photo now." The second man, shorter and white with wire-rimmed glasses and a briefcase that probably cost more than Patricia's car, whispered something to the taller man, who nodded once. They walked down the center aisle together, their shoes clicking on the tile floor. Every person in the courtroom watched them. The bailiff holding Marcus's arm had gone completely still. Judge Brennan emerged fully from behind his door, his expression confused and irritated. "What is the meaning of this? Court is adjourned. You'll have to..." The tall man stopped directly in front of the bench. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You just sentenced my son to life in prison." The words fell like stones into still water. Ripples spread outward. Diane Webb gasped. Patricia's eyes went wide. The prosecutor, Gerald Hutchins, dropped his files. Judge Brennan's face, ruddy and smug just moments before, went pale. Not just pale, white as paper, white as bone, white as a man who had just realized he'd made a catastrophic mistake, because everyone in that courtroom knew who the tall man was. His face had been on the cover of Time magazine. He'd given speeches at the United Nations. He'd argued cases before the Supreme Court. 3 months ago, he'd been confirmed by the Senate in a contentious hearing that had dominated the news cycle for weeks. His name was James Webb, and he was the Attorney General of the United States. The most powerful prosecutor in the country stood in a county courthouse in Illinois, staring at the judge who had just sentenced his son to die in prison. "My name is James Webb," the Attorney General said, his voice measured and cold. "This is my deputy, Michael Strauss. We've been driving for 6 hours because someone in your courthouse had the decency to call my office and tell me that my 17-year-old son was on trial for a crime he didn't commit. I got here as fast as I could. Apparently, not fast enough." Judge Brennan opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. No sound came out. "I've read the case file," Webb continued. "I read it in the car on the way here. No DNA evidence linking my son to the crime scene, no fingerprints, no forensic evidence of any kind. The weapon, a gun that was allegedly found in his backpack, has a broken chain of custody. It passed through 3 different evidence rooms and was logged incorrectly twice. The witness identification came from a traumatized convenience store clerk who viewed a photo array after the investigating officer told her she needed to help get this guy off the streets. That's called witness coaching, Your Honor. It's misconduct, but I'm sure you know that. The reporters were recording everything now. Phones held high, cameras clicking, voices whispering urgently into recorders. This was the story of the year, the decade, maybe. Patricia Gomez had tears running down her face, but she was smiling and crying at the same time because finally, someone with power was saying what she'd been trying to say for 6 months. The prosecution's case, Webb said, rested primarily on the testimony of a police officer who has been the subject of 14 excessive force complaints and 3 civil rights lawsuits. This officer claimed he saw my son running from the scene. He couldn't describe what my son was wearing, couldn't say which direction he was running, couldn't explain why, if he saw the perpetrator so clearly. It took him 3 days to identify my son from a photo lineup. But the jury heard his testimony, and they believed him. Because that's what juries do when they see a badge. Marcus was still standing between the judge's bench and the gallery, the bailiff's hand still on his arm. He couldn't process what was happening. His father, who he hadn't seen in person in almost 2 years because of work, because of Washington, because of everything, was here, in this courtroom, defending him. Mr. Attorney General, Judge Brennan finally managed, his voice shaking. This is highly irregular. If you have concerns about the proceedings, there are proper channels, appeals processes. You can file a motion for what? Webb's voice rose slightly, just enough to cut through the noise. A motion for reconsideration, so you can deny it like you've denied every other motion the defense has filed? A motion for a new trial, so you can schedule it 3 years from now, after my son has already spent 3 years in maximum security? No, Your Honor. We're past. Motions. Michael Strauss, the deputy, opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of papers. He handed them to Webb, who held them up for the courtroom to see. These, Webb said, are federal civil rights complaints filed this morning in the Northern District of Illinois. They name you Judge Brennan. They name the prosecutor, Mr. Hutchins. They name the arresting officer, Detective Paul Mahoney. They name this courthouse and this county. The charges include judicial misconduct, prosecutorial misconduct, denial of due process, and violation of my son's civil rights under the 14th Amendment. The Department of Justice will be investigating every case you've presided over in the last 5 years, Your Honor. Every conviction, every sentence, every procedural decision. And I promise you, we will find a pattern. Brennan's hands were shaking. He gripped the edge of his bench to steady himself. In addition, Webb continued, I'm issuing an immediate request to the governor for clemency and pardon. Given the circumstances and given the complete absence of credible evidence, I expect that request to be granted by the end of the week. But we're not going to wait for bureaucracy to fix what should never have happened in the first place. Bailiff, remove those handcuffs from my son. The bailiff looked at Judge Brennan, then at the Attorney General, then back at Brennan. He was a county employee, not a federal one. His loyalty was supposed to be to the judge, but his survival instinct was stronger. He uncuffed Marcus. Marcus's hands were free. For the first time in 6 months since his arrest, since the bail hearing where bail was denied because he was deemed a flight risk, since every pretrial detention hearing that kept him locked up, his hands were free. Webb walked toward him. The Attorney General of the United States crossed the courtroom and pulled his son into his arms. I'm sorry, Webb said quietly, his voice breaking for the first time. I'm so sorry I wasn't here sooner. I didn't know. They didn't tell me until yesterday. I'm sorry. Marcus couldn't speak. He just held on to his father and cried. Behind them, the courtroom had exploded. Reporters were shouting questions. The prosecutor was arguing with the deputy. Judge Brennan had collapsed into his chair, his face buried in his hands. Diane Webb had pushed through the gallery railing and was running toward her son, Keisha, right behind her. Patricia Gomez stood to the side, watching, tears still streaming down her face. She had fought this case alone for 6 months. She had filed every motion with hands that shook from exhaustion and coffee. She had visited Marcus in jail every week, promising him that justice existed even when he'd stopped believing. And now, finally, someone had listened. Your Honor, Gerald Hutchins said, his voice desperate, the jury returned a verdict. This court has jurisdiction. You can't just... Mr. Hutchins, Michael Strauss said, his voice calm. And lethal? I suggest you stop talking, right now. Anything you say from this point forward will be used against you in federal court. You have the right to remain silent. I recommend exercising it. Hutchins went pale. He gathered his files and hurried toward the exit, pushing past reporters who shouted questions at him. He didn't answer any of them. Judge Brennan finally looked up. His eyes were red. His hands were still shaking. What happens now? He asked, and his voice was small. James Webb released his son and turned to face the judge. His expression was cold. What happens now, Webb said, is that you're going to vacate that sentence. Immediately. You're going to order my son released on his own recognizance pending a full review of the case. And then you're going to sit in this courtroom and think very carefully about every decision you've made that brought you to this moment. And if I refuse? Webb's smile was sharp as broken glass. Then I'll have federal marshals in this building within the hour, and you'll be explaining your judicial philosophy to a grand jury. Your choice, Your Honor. It wasn't really a choice. They both knew it. Brennan picked up his gavel. His hand shook so badly that he nearly dropped it. The court vacates the sentence, he said. The defendant is released on his own recognizance pending further review. The gavel fell, quietly this time, without ceremony. Marcus Webb was free. His mother reached him and pulled him into her arms, sobbing. Keisha wrapped her arms around both of them. Uncle Raymond stood behind them, his stone face finally cracking, tears running into his beard. James Webb watched his family, and something in his chest, something that had been clenched tight since yesterday morning when he got the call, since he read the case file in the car, since he walked into this courtroom and saw his son in chains, finally loosened. We need to go, Michael Strauss said quietly. The media is going to be insane. We should get them out through the back. Webb nodded, but first he turned back to Patricia Gomez. Ms. Gomez, he said. Thank you for fighting, for not giving up. Patricia wiped her eyes. I'm a public defender, sir. It's what we do, even when nobody's watching. People are watching now, Webb said, and they're going to keep watching. I promise you that. He shook her hand, and then he turned to his family. Let's go home, he said. They left through the side door, surrounded by deputies and federal agents who had materialized as if from nowhere. The reporters tried to follow, but they were blocked. The questions echoed through the courthouse anyway. Attorney General Webb, how does it feel to know your son was almost sent to prison? Will there be an investigation into Judge Brennan? What message does this send about racial bias in the criminal justice system? Is this abuse of power? Webb didn't answer any of them, not yet, but he would. There would be press conferences and interviews and congressional testimony. There would be investigations and reforms, and maybe, if he fought hard enough, actual change. But right now, he just wanted to hold his son. They emerged from the courthouse into bright sunlight. Camera crews had already set up on the steps. Protesters had gathered, some supporting Marcus, some accusing Webb of nepotism and corruption. The world was watching. Webb put his arm around Marcus's shoulders and led him down the steps. Diane and Keisha followed close behind. The cameras flashed like lightning. Marcus looked back once at the courthouse, at the building where he had just been sentenced to die, at the windows where Judge Brennan was probably still sitting in his empty courtroom, contemplating his ruined career. Then, Marcus turned away and walked toward the car, toward home, toward freedom. Behind them, inside the courthouse, Judge Harold Brennan sat alone at his bench. The courtroom was empty now, except for a few straggling reporters and the bailiff who was slowly cleaning up. Brennan's gavel sat in front of him. He picked it up, felt its weight, and set it down again. He had been a judge for 20 years. He had sent hundreds of people to prison, thousands maybe. He had built a reputation on being tough, on never backing down, on believing in the system. But the system had just turned on him. The system had just revealed itself to be exactly what defense attorneys had been saying it was all along. Arbitrary and cruel and designed to chew up poor people and spit them out. Brennan thought about all the other cases, all the other defendants who had stood where Marcus Webb stood, who had pleaded for mercy or justice or just a fair shake, who had been denied and denied and denied. How many of them had been innocent? How many of them had been telling the truth? He didn't want to know, but he was going to find out. The Department of Justice was going to make sure of that. His phone buzzed, a text from his clerk. Media requests coming in. What should I tell them? Brennan didn't respond. He just sat there in his empty courtroom and waited for the end. Meanwhile, across town, Marcus Webb sat in the back of a black SUV with tinted windows, his mother on one side and his father on the other. Keisha sat in the front seat, twisted around to look at him, still crying. "I can't believe this is real," Marcus said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, hoarse from months of silence and fear. "It's real," James said. "You're free. You're coming home. What if they appeal? What if the prosecutor—" "They won't," James said firmly. "Trust me. By tomorrow morning, the prosecutor's office will be issuing a formal apology and dropping all charges. They don't have a choice. The evidence against you was manufactured, and now everyone knows it." Marcus wanted to believe that, but 6 months in jail had taught him not to trust promises, even from his father. "Why didn't you come sooner?" Marcus asked, and immediately regretted it. But the question had been sitting in his chest for months, festering. James's jaw tightened. "I didn't know. Your mother and we haven't been together in years. You know that. When you were arrested, she hired a public defender. She didn't tell me because she thought she could handle it. And I was in Washington dealing with Senate confirmations and appointments and 1,000 other things. I didn't know you'd been arrested until yesterday. A paralegal in the courthouse, someone who recognized your name, called my office. As soon as I found out, I dropped everything. I got in a car with Michael and drove 6 hours straight. I promise you, Marcus, if I had known sooner, I would have been there." Marcus looked at his mother. Diane was staring out the window, her jaw set. "Mom," Marcus said. "I thought I could fix it," Diane said quietly. "I thought if we just followed the process, if we trusted the system, it would work out. I didn't want to bother your father. He has important work to do. I thought—" She trailed off. Marcus understood. His mother had spent her whole life believing in the system, in courts and laws, and the idea that if you just played by the rules, justice would prevail. She had believed it right up until the moment that gavel fell. "It's not your fault," Marcus said. But maybe it was everyone's fault, or maybe it was the system's fault, or maybe fault didn't even matter because the result was the same. A 17-year-old kid in handcuffs, sentenced to life for a crime he didn't commit. The SUV pulled up to a hotel, the nicest one in the city, the kind with doormen and marble floors. They couldn't go home yet. The media knew where they lived. They needed a few days to let things settle, to let the lawyers work, to let the story move through its cycle. They checked in under fake names and went up to a suite on the top floor. Keisha immediately claimed one of the bedrooms. Diane collapsed onto the couch. James made phone calls in the other room, his voice low and urgent. Marcus stood at the window and looked out at the city. Somewhere down there, Judge Brennan was probably packing up his office. Gerald Hutchins was probably meeting with lawyers. Detective Mahoney was probably being questioned by internal affairs. And Marcus was here, in a hotel suite, free. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times in his cell. He had imagined walking out of the courthouse, breathing fresh air, seeing his family. But he had never imagined it like this. He had never imagined his father showing up like an avenging angel, tearing apart the system with nothing but words and authority. "You should eat something," Diane said from the couch. "When's the last time you had a real meal?" Marcus couldn't remember. Jail food was designed to keep you alive, not to nourish you. He had lost 15 pounds in 6 months. "I'm not hungry," he said. "Marcus, I'm fine, Mom." But he wasn't fine. He was free. But he wasn't fine. 6 months in a cage had done something to him. Something he couldn't quite name yet. Something that sat in his chest like a stone. James emerged from the bedroom, phone still in hand. "The governor's office called. They're expediting the clemency request. It'll be official by Friday. And the prosecutor formally dropped all charges an hour ago. It's over." Over. The word felt impossible. "What about Brennan?" Marcus asked. "What happens to him?" "There's going to be an investigation," James said. "The Department of Justice will review every case he's presided over. If we find a pattern of misconduct, and I'm confident we will, he'll be removed from the bench. He might face criminal charges. At minimum, his career is over." "Good," Marcus said, and he meant it. Judge Brennan had looked at him and seen nothing. Not a person, not a child, just a statistic. Just another case number to clear off the docket. He deserved whatever was coming, But then Marcus thought about all the other people Brennan had sentenced. All the other teenagers and young men and desperate people who didn't have an attorney general for a father. Who was fighting for them? "What about everyone else?" Marcus asked. James looked at him. "What do you mean?" "All the other people he sent to prison, the ones who didn't have you to save them. What happens to them?" The question hung in the air. James set his phone down. "That's the harder question," he admitted. "The Justice Department can investigate. We can recommend that cases be reviewed. But the legal process is slow. Appeals take years. And most of those defendants don't have the resources to fight. So they just stay in prison. Some of them, yes, that's how the system works." "That's not justice," Marcus said. "No," James agreed. "It's not." They stood in silence for a moment. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. "I want to do something," Marcus said. "I don't know what yet, but I can't just walk away from this. I was lucky. I had you. Most people don't." James studied his son. Marcus had always been thoughtful, even as a child. But there was something different in his eyes now, something harder and older. 6 months in jail had changed him. The system had tried to break him, and instead it had forged him into something stronger. "When you're ready," James said, "we'll figure it out together. But right now, you need to rest, you need to heal, and you need to be a kid again, at least for a little while." Marcus wanted to argue, but exhaustion hit him like a wave. 6 months of bad sleep and constant fear had worn him down to nothing. He nodded and headed to one of the bedrooms. He lay down on the bed, a real bed with clean sheets and soft pillows, and stared at the ceiling. Free. He was free. But freedom felt strange, like a coat that didn't quite fit. In the other room, Diane and James talked in low voices. Marcus couldn't hear the words, but he could hear the tone, worried, exhausted, angry. His parents had been separated for 3 years. They had loved each other once, but James's work had pulled him away. Long hours, constant travel, the weight of trying to reform a broken system from the inside. It had been too much for their marriage, but they had come together for this. For him. Marcus closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but every time he started to drift off, he would jerk awake, convinced he was back in his cell. The panic would spike, his heart would race, and he would have to remind himself, "You're free. You're safe. It's over." Except it wasn't over. Not really. The case might be closed, but the scars remained. The next morning, the story was everywhere. Every news channel, every website, every social media platform. "Attorney General's son wrongfully convicted" was the headline. Beneath it were photos of Marcus in handcuffs, photos of James Webb striding into the courthouse, photos of Judge Brennan looking pale and defeated. The think pieces started immediately. Some praised James Webb for using his power to save his son. Others accused him of corruption, of abusing his office, of proving that there were 2 justice systems, one for the powerful and one for everyone else. Both takes were partially right. James held a press conference that afternoon. He stood behind a podium in a hotel conference room, cameras everywhere, reporters shouting questions. Michael Strauss stood beside him. Marcus watched from the back of the room with his mother and sister. "Yesterday," James began, his voice steady, "my son was sentenced to life in prison for a crime he didn't commit. The evidence against him was weak, circumstantial, and in some cases outright fabricated. His constitutional rights were violated at every stage of the process. And when I read the case file, I realized something that should terrify every American. If this could happen to my son, the son of the Attorney General, someone with every advantage and resource, it can happen to anyone." The room was silent except for the click of cameras. "Let me be clear," James continued. "I did not abuse my power yesterday. I exercised it. And that's what power is for, to protect the vulnerable, to correct injustice, to ensure that the law applies equally to everyone. My son is free today because I had the resources and the knowledge to fight back. But thousands of other people are sitting in prisons right now for crimes they didn't commit. They're there because they had overworked public defenders, because they couldn't afford bail, because the system ground them down until they accepted plea deals just to make it stop." He paused, letting the words sink in. "The Department of Justice will be conducting a comprehensive review of the judicial district where my son was tried, We'll be looking at conviction rates, sentencing patterns, and whether defendants' civil rights were systematically violated. This isn't about revenge, it's about accountability. And if we find that other people were wrongfully convicted, we will work to free them. The reporters erupted with questions. Are you saying Judge Brennan should be prosecuted? What about the prosecutor? Is this a conflict of interest? Will you recuse yourself from the investigation? James held up a hand. I'll answer a few questions. He pointed to a reporter in the front. Attorney General Webb, critics say you're using your position to benefit your family. How do you respond? I respond by saying that every parent would do the same thing if they had the power. The problem isn't that I save my son. The problem is that most parents can't. The problem is a system that routinely fails poor people and people of color. My son's case isn't unique. It's just unusually visible. And now that it's visible, we have a responsibility to fix the underlying problems. Another reporter. What about the other defendants Judge Brennan convicted? Will they all get new trials? That's up to the courts, but we'll be recommending that every case from the last 5 years be reviewed for potential misconduct. If we find evidence of wrongdoing, we'll refer those cases for reconsideration. A third reporter. Do you think your son would have been convicted if he weren't black? James's expression hardened. I think the data speaks for itself. Black defendants are more likely to be stopped, more likely to be arrested, more likely to be denied bail, more likely to be convicted, and more likely to receive harsher sentences than white defendants accused of the same crimes. My son's race absolutely played a role in how he was treated, and that's why this work matters. Marcus watched his father navigate the press conference with practiced ease. This was what James Webb did. He took complex, painful issues and made them understandable. He made people care. It was why he had been appointed Attorney General in the first place. But Marcus wondered if caring was enough. People had cared before. There had been protests and reforms and promises. And yet, the system kept grinding forward, chewing up lives, spitting out bodies. After the press conference, they went back to the suite. James disappeared into the bedroom to take more calls. Diane ordered room service. Keisha scrolled through social media, reading the reactions. People are saying Dad's a hero, Keisha said, but also that he's corrupt, also that he should run for president, also that the whole thing is staged. The internet is wild. Marcus didn't want to look at social media. He didn't want to see his face on the news, didn't want to read strangers' opinions about his life. Come eat, Diane said, setting out plates of food. They ate in silence. It should have been a celebration. Marcus was free. The charges were dropped. Justice had been served. But it didn't feel like a celebration. It felt like survival. That night, Marcus lay in bed and thought about the other kids, the ones still in jail, still waiting for trials, still hoping that someone would believe them. He thought about the public defenders who fought impossible battles with no resources. He thought about the families sitting in courtroom galleries, watching their children get sentenced, powerless to stop it. He had been lucky, unbelievably, impossibly lucky. And that luck came with a responsibility. The next few days passed in a blur. Lawyers came and went, papers were signed, the official clemency came through. The charges were formally expunged from Marcus's record as if the whole nightmare had never happened, except it had happened, and Marcus would carry it with him forever. On Friday evening, James sat down with Marcus in the hotel suite. Everyone else had gone to bed. I need to go back to Washington soon, James said, but I want you to come with me, you and your mother and Keisha. I have a house there. It's big enough for all of us. You can finish high school, think about college, take some time to figure out what you want to do next. Marcus considered this. Part of him wanted to say yes, wanted to disappear into his father's world where power and privilege could shield him from the ugliness of the system. But another part of him, the part that had been forged in a jail cell, knew that running away wasn't the answer. I want to help, Marcus said. The other people, the ones still locked up. You will, James promised. But you have to take care of yourself first. You've been through trauma, Marcus, real trauma. You need therapy, you need support, you need time to process what happened. I know, Marcus said, but I also know that every day I spend recovering is another day that someone else is sitting in a cell, waiting for a miracle that might never come. James looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw someone he barely recognized. The boy who had been arrested 6 months ago had been soft, idealistic, full of hope. The young man sitting before him now was harder, sharper, carved by injustice into something new. "You remind me of myself," James said quietly. "When I was young, before I learned how slow change really is." "Maybe it doesn't have to be slow," Marcus said. James smiled, but it was a sad smile. "Maybe not, but it usually is." They sat in silence for a while, father and son, both thinking about justice and power and the long, difficult road ahead. On Saturday, they finally went home. The media circus had died down slightly. There were other stories now, other scandals, other tragedies to cover. But there were still reporters outside the house, still cameras filming as they pulled into the driveway. Marcus walked into his childhood home and felt like a stranger. Everything was exactly as he had left it 6 months ago. His room, his books, his posters on the wall. But he wasn't the same person who had lived here. That person was gone, locked away forever in a cell. His mother tried to make everything normal. She cooked his favorite meals. She asked about his plans for finishing high school. She talked about the future as if the past 6 months could just be forgotten. But Marcus couldn't forget. Every time he closed his eyes, he was back in jail. Every time he heard a door close, he flinched. Every time he saw a police car, his heart raced. He started having nightmares. In them, he was back in the courtroom, and Judge Brennan was sentencing him again. But this time, his father didn't show up. This time, no one came to save him. He would wake up gasping, drenched in sweat, convinced that freedom had been a dream. His mother scheduled appointments with therapists. Marcus went dutifully, sat in their offices, answered their questions. They talked about PTSD and trauma and coping mechanisms. They gave him exercises to practice, techniques to manage his anxiety. It helped a little, but it didn't change the fundamental truth. The system had tried to destroy him, and it had almost succeeded, and it was still out there, still destroying other people, every single day. 2 weeks after his release, Marcus got a letter. It came in a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a handwritten note. "My name is David Torres. I was sentenced by Judge Brennan 3 years ago. Armed robbery. I got 15 years. I didn't do it, but my public defender told me to take a plea deal because I'd probably get more if I went to trial. I took it. I've been in prison ever since. I saw your story on the news. I saw what your dad did. I know I'm not the Attorney General's son. I know nobody's coming to save me. But maybe you could tell your dad about my case. Maybe he could help. I'm 19 years old. I'll be 34 when I get out. If I get out, please, I'm begging you. Look at my case." The letter included case numbers, dates, details. Marcus read it 3 times, his hands shaking. By the end of the week, he had received 47 more letters. They came from all over, from prisons downstate, from jails in neighboring counties, from defendants awaiting trial. They all told similar stories: bad lawyers, worse evidence, judges who didn't care, lives destroyed by a system that valued efficiency over truth. Marcus showed the letters to his father. "I knew this would happen," James said quietly. "Once people know you have access to power, they reach out, they hope." "Can we help them?" Marcus asked. "Some of them maybe, but not all. There are thousands of wrongful convictions in this country, Marcus. Tens of thousands. We can't fix them all. But we could fix some." James looked at the stack of letters. Then he looked at his son. "Yes," he said. "We could fix some." They started small. James assigned a team of lawyers from the Justice Department to review the cases Marcus had received. They looked for patterns of misconduct, violations of due process, evidence of actual innocence. Out of the first 50 cases, they found 12 that warranted further investigation. David Torres's case was one of them. His conviction had been based primarily on a coerced confession. He had been interrogated for 14 hours without a lawyer, without food, without sleep, until he said what the police wanted to hear. The actual robber had been caught 6 months later, committing another crime, and he matched the description much better than David did. But by then, David was already in prison, and no one cared enough to revisit the case. James's team filed a motion for post-conviction relief. 3 months later, David Torres walked out of prison. He had served 3 years for a crime he didn't commit. It wasn't justice. Justice would have been never putting him there in the first place. But it was something. Marcus attended the hearing where David was released. He watched David's family cry with relief. He watched David step out into the sunlight, blinking, disoriented, free. Afterward, David found Marcus in the courthouse lobby. "Thank you," David said. His voice broke. "Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring." Marcus shook his hand. "I'm sorry it took so long. I'm sorry it happened at all." "It's not your fault," David said. But Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that, somehow, it was all their fault. Everyone who knew the system was broken and didn't fight hard enough to fix it. Over the next year, James Webb's Justice Department opened investigations into 12 judicial districts across the country. They found patterns of misconduct everywhere they looked: judges who rushed through cases, prosecutors who hid exculpatory evidence, police who coerced confessions. They recommended reforms, filed civil rights lawsuits, pushed for new legislation. It was slow work. It was frustrating work. For every person they freed, there were 10 more waiting. For every corrupt judge removed from the bench, there were others who learned to hide their misconduct better. But they kept working. Marcus finished high school. He applied to colleges. He got accepted to several, including Yale and Harvard. Everyone assumed he would study law, follow in his father's footsteps. But Marcus had other ideas. "I want to study journalism," he told his father. "I want to tell these stories. I want people to understand what's happening in courtrooms every day, all across this country." James was surprised. "Why journalism? You could do more good as a lawyer." "Maybe," Marcus said, "but lawyers work on one case at a time. Journalists can change the conversation. They can make people care. And if people care enough, maybe the system will have to change." James thought about this, then he smiled. "You're right," he said. "Go be a journalist. Tell the stories that need to be told." Marcus went to college. He studied journalism and criminal justice. He spent his summers interning at newspapers and news websites. He wrote articles about wrongful convictions, about prosecutorial misconduct, about the school-to-prison pipeline. His first major article, published in his junior year, was about Judge Harold Brennan. It detailed Brennan's 2-decade career, his conviction rates, his sentencing patterns. It included interviews with defendants Brennan had sentenced, with their families, with lawyers who had practiced in his courtroom. The picture that emerged was of a judge who saw defendants as numbers, not people, who valued efficiency over justice, who had destroyed countless lives without a second thought. By the time the article was published, Brennan had already been removed from the bench. The Justice Department's investigation had found extensive evidence of misconduct. He had lost his pension, his reputation, his legacy. He was facing criminal charges for violating defendants' civil rights. Marcus didn't feel triumphant when he heard the news. He just felt tired. One corrupt judge removed, thousands more still on the bench. But he kept writing. His senior year, he published an investigation into the prosecutor from his own case, Gerald Hutchins. Hutchins had resigned from the prosecutor's office shortly after Marcus's case fell apart, but he had opened a private practice and was doing quite well for himself. Marcus's article revealed that during his time as a prosecutor, Hutchins had withheld exculpatory evidence in at least 15 cases. Several of those defendants were still in prison. The article sparked outrage. Bar associations opened ethics investigations. Several of Hutchins' convictions were overturned. Hutchins himself was eventually disbarred. Marcus graduated with honors. He got job offers from major newspapers. He chose the one that would let him focus on criminal justice reporting. For the next 5 years, Marcus traveled the country, investigating wrongful convictions, exposing judicial corruption, telling the stories of people the system had failed. His articles won awards. They changed laws. They freed innocent people, but they didn't fix the system. The system was too big, too entrenched, too resistant to change. Still, Marcus kept working. Because what else could he do? Give up? Accept that injustice was inevitable? Let the David Torreses of the world rot in prison while the Harold Brennans went unpunished? No. He would keep fighting, one story at a time, one case at a time, one freed person at a time. Because that's what you did when you had been saved. You spent the rest of your life trying to save others. 10 years after his wrongful conviction, Marcus Webb stood in the same courthouse where he had been sentenced to life in prison. But this time, he wasn't a defendant. He was there to cover a Another case of alleged misconduct, another defendant claiming innocence. He stood in the gallery, notebook in hand, watching the proceedings. The defendant was a young woman, maybe 20 years old, black, scared. Her public defender looked exhausted. The prosecutor looked confident. The judge looked bored. Marcus had seen this play 1,000 times. He knew how it would end, unless someone intervened. Unless someone with power decided to care. Unless the system, for once, chose justice over efficiency. The prosecutor made his closing argument. The public defender made hers. The jury filed out to deliberate. Marcus stayed in the courtroom, watching, waiting. He would write about this case no matter what happened. He would make sure people knew this woman's name, knew her story, because that was the only power he had. The power to witness, to document, to refuse to let these injustices happen in darkness. The jury came back 3 hours later. Guilty. The young woman collapsed. Her family wailed. The judge scheduled sentencing for next month. Marcus took notes. He would write the article tonight. He would reach out to criminal justice organizations, to advocates, to lawyers who might take up her appeal. He would do what he always did. Fight, in the only way he knew how. As he left the courthouse, he thought about his own case, about Judge Brennan, who had died 2 years ago of a heart attack, still facing criminal charges, about Gerald Hutchins, who had declared bankruptcy after the lawsuits, about Detective Mahoney, who had retired with full pension before the investigations could touch him. Justice, of a sort. But not enough. Never enough. Marcus pulled out his phone and called his father. "I just covered another wrongful conviction," he said when James answered. "Young woman black, first-time defendant. I think there's grounds for appeal." "Send me the case file," James said immediately. "I'll have someone look at it." "Thanks, Dad." "That's what I'm here for." They hung up. Marcus stood on the courthouse steps, watching people come and go, lawyers and defendants, families and reporters, all of them caught up in the machinery of justice. He thought about the letter he had received that morning, another plea for help from someone in prison, and the one before that, and the one before that. They never stopped coming. He couldn't save them all, but he could save some, and some was better than none. Marcus walked down the steps and headed back to his office. He had an article to write, calls to make, a system to fight. It was exhausting work. It was heartbreaking work. But it was his work. The work he had been preparing for since the day he stood in handcuffs, waiting for his life to end. And his father walked through those doors. Power meant nothing when justice walked through the door. Marcus Webb had learned that lesson well. And he would spend the rest of his life making sure others learned it too, because the system wouldn't change on its own. It had to be forced to change, one case at a time, one article at a time, one freed person at a time, and Marcus Webb was just getting started.